Welcome, everybody. It's Friday, November 21st, 2014. And we're going to talk a little bit today about Japan as a failed Keynesian experiment. We're also going to talk about Paul Krugman, of course, with our guest Bob Murphy. Robert P. Murphy is a frequent guest of this program. He holds a Ph.D. in economics from New York University. He's the author of numerous books, including Lessons for the Young Economist, a textbook, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, and study guides for the major Austrian economic treatises, namely Human Action, The Theory of Money and Credit, and Man, Economy, and State. Bob blogs at consultingbyrpm.com. Make sure and stay tuned for our entire conversation because we have a big announcement to make at the very end. And then I have a smaller announcement to make after the big announcement. So here we go. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Always a pleasure.
Let's talk about Japan a little bit. This is in the news. They've been engaged in a Keynesian, I hate the word experiment, but they've been engaged in Keynesian policy for a quarter century now. And just recently, figures came out for, I guess, GDP growth there, and they were expecting, well, a couple percentage points positive, and it turns out they keep sinking ever lower. And yet, I don't see a lot of people saying on the Keynesian side, maybe this means that there's something wrong with our whole paradigm, we got to rethink it. Unpack for us, what exactly is going on in Japan, first of all?
Well, sure. So the immediate news, as you say, is that they had really terrible real GDP growth numbers. That's the thing that the financial press cares about and government officials. And so everyone's wringing their hands and saying, "Oh, gee, maybe we shouldn't have raised, the retail sales taxes," because they did back in April. They raised them, and then they're supposed to raise them again. And the reason for that, though, is it's not like that just came out of nowhere. The reason for that is Japan's government debt to GDP ratio is the highest in the world. Okay, they have. It depends what figures you use, but they have more than double what the U.S. Comparable figure would be. So well over 200% of Japan's GDP, the government has that much in its debt. And where did that come from? As you said, Tom, it's because Japan has been engaged in what the rest of the world has been doing since the crisis, but Japan's been doing it since the 90s. Okay, and people may remember that phrase, the lost decade, or now it's like lost decades, plural, of Japan. And that's what people are referring to, that they had a huge stock market crash, real estate crash, from going from the late 80s into the 90s, and they've never recovered from that. Okay, the best thing I've seen in a while is if you Google Ben Powell avoid Japan's mistakes. He had an op-ed in the Washington Times where he just walked through the history of that if people want to go and see the actual numbers. But the point is Japan has just been mired in this rut for literally going on 2 decades now, and the irony is, notice I'm not even putting words in their mouth. When people, if you remember, Tom, when we were arguing about the Fed expanding its balance sheet and so on, and the government running up huge debt, one of the Keynesian standard arguments to say that, hey, you guys worried about, spiking interest rates and price inflation, you're wrong, because Japan's been doing this for a decade now, and they didn't have that problem. But so you want to say, okay, so why would we start doing something, the Keynesian solution that Japan has been trying for more than a decade, and they're still stuck? So it's so both sides are sort of agreeing that Japan has been doing this for a long time now, and gee, it's just not enough. It's never enough, is it?
I'm hoping to get David Stockman back on the program sometime next month. He just wrote at least one really excellent column on Japan over at David Stockman's Contra Corner. And the thing that jumped out at me in that piece was that when you look at the index of industrial production, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know how they measure that, but he's going back about 25 years, and he says it's at 96.8, and today it's at 96.8. So he says, so in other words, they've had a quarter century of Keynesian policy, and they are exactly where they were at the beginning. That's pretty unimpressive, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that particular number, but that certainly sounds plausible to me. Just to give you another sense of just how bad it is, the Nikkei 225, right? So that's like the Japanese stock market index that everybody reports on CNBC and the Wall Street Journal. That back in 1990 was about 38,500 or so. I'm looking at the Fred graph here, and then it fell, and it has never gotten to more than half of that since. And I'm talking nominal terms, right? So can you imagine you had money in the stock market in Japan as of 1990? There was a big crash, and you're still waiting to get back to where you were in 1990 in nominal terms, right? So that's really just to give you a sense of how bad things are over there in terms of the conventional way that pundits look at the health of an economy. And again, it's not that, oh, well, Japan must have been doing, Calvin Coolidge type policies. No, they were doing all sorts of, ostensibly textbook Keynesian things like running up huge budget deficits and expanding their balance sheet. And so it's, and the other thing too is, this latest round, the Abe coming in, and then Kurata, the central bank chairman. What their goal is to promote price inflation, right? So it's not like that's an unfortunate side effect. Everybody is urging Japan, saying you need to push up your prices so that you get at least 2%. And they just say inflation, but it means price inflation. And that's the thing. And oh man, they're just not inflating enough. And if only they could trick the Japanese public into thinking that there's going to be price inflation, so they go out and spend the money. And so it just shows the logical conclusion of Keynesianism, where the way you fix an economy is to get everyone to realize the money is not a good asset to hold and to get rid of it. And I just, among other things, we can look at historical events and we can do all kinds of sophisticated analysis, but just to try to grab the public at the gut level and say, are you sure this is a good idea? That's what their avowed policy is. They want to convince the public that the yen is a bad thing to hold and to get rid of it, to turn it into a hot potato. And I'm hoping some people just recognize that doesn't really make sense, that the government's goal is to go out and convince people that the money they use is a bad thing to hold.
What about the excuse that we need to engage in this expansionary monetary policy to avoid deflation, that deflation and Japan have been mentioned in the same sentence so many times that we assume there was some terrible crisis where deflation was threatened. Now, leave aside whether or not deflation is a real threat. We've addressed that on the show before. Not that it would hurt to mention it again, but was that really a problem? Was there a specter of deflation to begin with?
Well, I don't know whether you want to use specter, because you said that's kind of a loaded term. It is true. Let me make sure your listeners understand that the CPI, the conventional measurement in Japan, that has been roughly flat. So, people can go to the St. Louis Fed's website if they want to see these things. But for example, from about the early 1990s, if you called that up 100 for their consumer price index, until fairly recently, it was back at 100 again. So it would go up a little bit, then it would go down a little bit. So over long stretches, they did have a roughly stable consumer price index. And so that is the case, but I'm not sure what that's supposed to prove. It's certainly not that the Keynesian story, which is to say, when you get stuck in one of these ruts, you just can't, you're stuck forever, and no matter what the central bank does, it's pushing on a string. That's certainly not true, because what happened is, if you look at a chart of Japan's monetary base, the total amount of assets that the Bank of Japan holds, that was rising pretty rapidly, and then in the mid-2000s, they dropped it rapidly. They sold off a bunch of assets. Okay, they sucked a bunch of money out of the system, if you want to think of it that way. And so why did they do that? Well, because consumer prices in Japan had actually started going positive, and they didn't want that. So the people running the Bank of Japan do really, they're much more committed to stable consumer prices than their counterparts at other central banks. So that's true. But from that, you shouldn't conclude that, oh man, those poor people, they're just stuck. They can't get prices to rise. No, as a matter of policy, they were pumping in all kinds of money, and then when consumer prices started ticking up, they sucked a bunch of it out. And that's how they reassured the public that we're not going to let consumer prices get out of hand. So the thing, again, to repeat myself, that's different in the last couple of years is now the leadership is telling everybody, whoa, we're doing an about face. You know how we've maintained the strength of the yen in terms of consumer goods for all this time? We're not doing that anymore. Our active plan now is to make the yen become weaker. So that's what the new twist is. And everybody was praising them, and it looked good for a while. The yen fell against other currencies, and both Keynesians and market monetarists were, lauding these new efforts. And then all of a sudden, the economy's back into a bad recession, as it seems to be. And so everyone's like, oh, well, it's something else. It's, it's not the fault of printing a bunch of money.
Stockman seems to suggest there's a subtext beneath all this, that when the inflationary policy is being recommended, that it's not just that they're saying we need to do this to avoid deflation. We also need to do this to devalue the tremendous debt that Japan has taken on. It's something like a 230% debt to GDP ratio, and they're thinking that inflation helps to erode that, and maybe inflation can jumpstart the economy, or some kind of give it some kind of push. Do you think there's something to that?
Well, I definitely agree with Stockman's analysis that those things all go together, and it's sort of like the Gruber approach to health reform, that a lot of things, you could talk about a policy that's going to do a bunch of stuff, but then if you're going to sell it to the public, you maybe want to stress one element of it and kind of sweep under the rug the other stuff that doesn't make it sound so appealing. So I think that's what's going on here. Clearly, if you pump in a bunch more yen compared to what the status quo would have been, then the yen's going to be weaker against foreign currencies. And so if you're an exporter, that might give you a short-term boost. Certainly, consumers and businesses are going to be less likely to sit on yen-denominated assets. They might go and spend more if they think that the currency is going to weaken in the near future. So that's certainly true. So if you're a Keynesian economist and you think the reason economies are bad is that people just aren't spending enough and they're saving too much, well, that might be a feather in your cap. And certainly, given an outstanding amount of nominal government debt, if the yen weakens, well, then it's easier to service that debt. So those things are all true, but it's, again, I don't think you'd see finance ministers or something getting up and saying, oh, the reason we're going to do this is because we want to weaken the purchasing power of our currency so that it's easier for us to pay for our past profligacy. They're probably not going to come out and say that, even though that's what the economists behind the scenes know is maybe one of the main reasons.
Let's shift gears and talk about Paul Krugman, although we're not really shifting gears because Krugman has been commenting on Japan, and it would be interesting to hear your comments on Krugman's comments on Japan.
Sure. So, the guy is funny. So it was on November 13th, I believe. He came out and he posted a picture from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, showing what had happened to tax rates for various income groups under Barack Obama, as part of the legislation. So going from 2012 to 2013, and the chart from the CBO showed that income tax rates went up on every single income group across the board. They went up more on the upper 1% than compared to the other groups, but nonetheless, everybody's income tax rates went up according to the CBO chart. And Krugman just completely ignored the fact that income tax rates went up on everybody else and just was telling his progressive readers, hey, let's give Obama some credit. He really has been trying to address inequality. Look at how much he raised taxes on the upper 1%. Let's give him some credit. All right, that was his sole commentary. He didn't even mention the fact that income tax went up on everybody else. 4 days later, when the news of Japan came out and their GDP contraction, Krugman's lamenting that in his blog, saying, I can't believe they went ahead with that sales tax increase back in April. Contractionary policy is contractionary. I could have told them that. In fact, I have been telling that over and over, but some people just don't listen. These deficit hawks just, need to address the debt problem now. And so just going on and lamenting, like, how could these idiots have possibly thought it would be a good idea to raise taxes when the economy was so weak to deal with the debt crisis that surely could have been, we could have let that slide for a few years to make sure the economy had its feet. So, again, it's just the standard thing with Paul Krugman that, to him, addressing inequality, that's fine to raise taxes on everybody so long as you raise it more on rich people, even in the midst of what he still thinks is the U.S. in the liquidity trap, that's fine. But, oh my gosh, raising sales taxes in order to deal with the debt-to-GDP ratio that's the highest in the world, well, no, that's just crazy. And he just can't believe these people would ignore the sound recommendation coming from Krugman that you never raise taxes in the midst of a weak economy. What are you thinking?
Explain to everybody this is your term, what a Krugman contradiction is. Contradiction spelled with a K.
Sure. So I had to come up with some term because Krugman, he's a very smart guy. Some people are always like, Bob, why do you keep even reading that guy? Let's just ignore him. Well, he's a Nobel laureate in economics, and he's hands down the literally planet Earth leading Keynesian apologist. And so, I think it even, but on that, he's also very smart, and so he'll come up with sort of logically consistent defenses of his position, right? Because he's clever and he knows a bunch of economics. And the thing is, with mainstream economics, you can say whatever the heck you want, right? You can just spit out any output you need. And so what he'll do on various issues, even though they're technically, there was certainly some tension, and I labeled that a classic Krugman contradiction with the analysis I just gave, that he went from one day congratulating President Obama for raising taxes on the upper 1% and just ignoring the fact that his own chart showed he raised them on everybody else as well in the midst of a weak economy, and then 4 days later is lamenting, I can't believe the people in Japan raised taxes. Don't they know that that's the wrong thing to do in the midst of a weak economy? Right, so you could say, did he technically contradict himself in the sense of, saying A is not A? Well, no, he didn't do that. And on each thing, and I know his partisans would defend him because they do it in the comments of my blog. They come in and say, well, no, see the differences. So it's not a formal contradiction, and it's a matter of pure logic, but clearly he knows what he wants the policy conclusions to be, or he knows, oh, geez, if there's a recession, even though Japan has been doing exactly what I recommended in terms of its monetary policy, I need to come up with some reason that they didn't listen to my advice. He's not just going to say, yeah, they followed my advice and it blew up in their face. So he's got to come up with something, but he's very clever, and so will often be able to thread the needle to make it look like I'm technically not contradicting myself, even though he's completely switched the whole tone of his analysis. In a regular reader of Krugman's would surely utter outright contradictions if he tried to sort of paraphrase what the master's position was, because it's so tortured and careful to avoid those landmines that he set for himself.
Well, Bob, we've reached that part of the show where I think we have to reveal the secret that you and I have been keeping, for a good 2 weeks now, I would say. I don't know which one of us should do. Let me start and you jump in, all right? I'll tell everybody what it is and why I think it'll be great, and then you expound on why it's going to be even greater than why I'm underselling it. All right, so if you guys listen to, I first of all, I can't believe how many people tell me they listen to this show every day. Like, I almost don't believe you. Like, I do appreciate it. That's wonderful. But I get so many people saying I never miss an episode. That's really wonderful. Like, that excites me. It's great. I'm glad people listen. But if you are a constant listener, you'll know from an episode in which I replayed an interview I did with Bob Wenzel that I was, I was kind of tweaking Bob a little bit, saying, I got this great idea for Murphy and he won't do it. The idea was that he should have his own podcast, and it only has to be once a week, a weekly podcast. Leave them wanting more, I always say. A weekly podcast, maybe half an hour, and every week when Krugman's New York Times column comes out, you dismantle it every single week until he goes away. It's just over and over and relentless. This would be not only fantastic, not only would it drive him crazy because he's vain and he'll know about it, there's no question about it, but also it would advance economic education. It would bring people to the Austrian school. This would not just be so-called preaching to the choir, because a lot of people don't like Krugman, but they don't know anything about Austrian economics. They just know that Krugman's economics is all screwed up and they believe in the free market, but they don't know about the Austrian school in particular. We can get a lot of people understanding that. We can bring a lot of people into the fold in that way. So what we decided to do to try to help out Bob, who has a lot of work like me, is that since I've become a bit seasoned as a podcaster, that means old, that means I've gotten to know a little bit more about how it works. I know how to set up a podcast and all that. So I said, what if we did that podcast together? We both talk about the Krugman column. I maybe have you do some of the heavy lifting, but there's always something we can both say about it. And every single week, Krugman's column comes out, we have a response. I don't think there is any podcast like that on any topic that specifically takes on one high-profile person in a specific way every single week relentlessly. But that's what we're going to do starting in early 2015. We're not giving a date because everything that it takes to set this up always takes 10 times longer than you expect it to. But we're just trying to whet your appetites. And then, of course, we need a little bit of your input, but we'll get to that in a minute. Bob, what do you want to add to this?
Well, I just want to affirm that, yes, it's a great idea, first of all, but there's plenty of things where either Tom or other people have pitched to me and said, Murphy, you ought to be doing that. And I agree with them. I say, you're right, I should be. And then I know it's not going to happen because I'm so busy with stuff, or there's a huge learning curve involved. So then when Tom came to me and said, okay, here's the deal, I will do a lot of the technical stuff, and then you just come in and contribute your analysis. And then I was like, you sold me. This is great. And I know there's naysayers. No, guys, you're giving this guy too much of a platform. Well, look, first of all, we're still going to be doing our other stuff, right? It's not like our whole lives are going to revolve around Paul Krugman, but also I know when I go to other people's blogs and they have a really good analysis of Krugman, and especially when they show how what he's saying in his current column clearly is at odds with what he said when, say, George Bush was president, or even just a few years ago before the situation turned around, even when Obama was president. I love seeing stuff like that because everyone, look at, Tom is right, even people who are not ideological, they like reading a critique of Krugman because he's such a jerk to people, right? The guy is he's so arrogant, people don't like that. It's like you're watching A Christmas Story and you're waiting for Ralphie to go and tackle the bully, right? It's not because you care so much about the rifle and so forth. It's because people don't like bullies, and Krugman is a quintessential bully on the internet, as silly as that is to say. He goes around and just mocks people, literally saying people who disagree with him are knaves or fools. And so a lot of academics really would like to see him get taken down a peg or two. And so if Tom and I have to be the guys that do it, well, then we're just going to be the ones, gosh darn it.
Now, here's where you guys come in. We don't know what to call the show. It needs to be a short title. It needs to convey something of what we're going to be doing. And I would prefer that it not spell anything with a K that's supposed to be spelled with a C, like Krugman Contradiction, which is spelled with a K, to indicate that it's not strictly speaking a contradiction, but it's as close as you can logically get without actually outright being one. So I'm going to open up a thread. Now, see, this is why it'd be great if my new site were up, but the problem is I'm using the design company is great, but the coding company is in Australia. And so every day I wake up and they're already in bed. So here's my feedback. It takes 2 days to get everything done. So this has taken twice as long to get done. Anyway, what we'll do is we'll put it up over on my Facebook page, facebook.com/Thomas E. Woods. Today I'm going to put up there a thread asking for your input. What should we call this show? And if you come up with the name that we use, what are we going to do? We didn't talk about this, Bob, before going on the air here. Is there something we can do for these people? What can we do?
Well, I was thinking maybe they could go to a Broadway show with Paul Krugman.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, so supposing he's not available, we'll figure out something. We'll send you some books or whatever you want, basically. You make us an offer. I'll just put it that way. Just if there's something that I'm providing. Look, I could give you the courses at TomWoodsHomeschool.com. I give you a subscription to LibertyClassroom.com. I'll send you a couple of books. Notice how I'm carrying all the weight here. Maybe Bob could not be a bum.
Right. I can. The thing I'll throw in is the person can pick a song that I will go do at the karaoke bar and put on my YouTube channel.
Oh, right. Okay, there
can't be any profanity, or if there is, I will not sing that word. That's the only requirement.
Okay. All right. Well, great. All right. Look. All right. That's fantastic. Great. All right. So, look, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff if you come up with something that's good. So stay tuned for this. It'll be coming in early 2015. And for those of you who say, Woods, your show should be longer. Well, now you're getting half an hour extra per week of Woods/Murphy. If this isn't a success, then I don't understand the universe. Is that how you feel, Bob?
I get really nervous when you say something.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I know. If this is a big flop, then we have to come back and say, look, nobody's perfect. But this can't be. In fact, then we could just guilt people into listening. So if we fail, Krugman wins, right?
Let's say it like this. If it's not a success, it's because your fans aren't smart enough.
Okay, good. Taunt them if necessary. All right, listen, Bob, thanks a lot. Make sure and follow Bob's blog, by the way. consultingbyrpm.com, and then just click on the blog, or consultingbyrpm.com/blog. Bob blogs at a very Well, he blogs frequently, but he can blog at a high level and at a popular level. He can blog on Krugman, and you think, wow, he just nailed Krugman. And then he can blog on abstruse economic topics, and you say, I don't really understand what he's saying, but I know he's really smart, and I'm sure this is important. And then you think, on a topic like this that's so difficult, it'd probably be 0 comments. It's like 817 comments. Like, I don't know where your commenters come from, Bob, but they knock my socks off. So anyway, follow Bob Murphy, and Bob, thanks for your time today.
Sure thing, and the answer is they're from the FBI. That's where they come from. Sure.
Yeah, where else? Where else? At least they're learning, right? At least they're learning. All right, thanks again, Bob.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, everybody, a couple of notes for the future. Next week, we'll have programming except on Thanksgiving Day. We'll have shows on all the other days, so make sure and tune in. Also, we are fast approaching episode number 300. It amazes me. 300 episodes of this show. Couldn't have done it without you guys listening in and without you guys spreading the word for me, getting the word out there. I'm deeply grateful for all the support we've gotten. Remember, I've got a special extra gift, surprise gift you didn't know you were getting that some of the supporting listeners are getting. Check that out at tomwoods.com/bigbigtrain, and you will see what it is that I am going to send you on request. And if you're not yet a supporting listener, the bag of goodies just keeps getting fatter and fatter. This particular item is available only for the month of November 2014. But the bag of goodies gets bigger and bigger at supportinglisteners.com. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. See you next week.
The Tom Woods Show.